Welcome back. Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 56. There's a moment that happens in teams that most leaders completely miss. Nothing explodes, no one argues, no one walks out. On the surface, everything looks fine. People nod in meetings, deadlines are met, mostly. Communication sounds professional, respectful, controlled, and yet performance is slipping. Execution feels slower. Energy feels lower. Decisions take longer than they should, and nobody can quite explain why. Because the real problem isn't visible. It's not loud. It's not obvious. It's trust. Or more specifically, the lack of it. Low trust doesn't announce itself. It hides. It disguises itself as professionalism, as politeness, as alignment. What's actually happening underneath the surface is far more dangerous. People stop telling the truth. They start filtering, holding back, second guessing what they say and how they say it. Not because they don't care, but because they don't feel safe enough to be fully honest. And the moment that starts happening inside a team, performance begins to erode. Not all at once, but consistently. Quick note before we dive in, this podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If you have something you need to go get, make sure you go and get it. We want you guys to get taken care of. On top of that, all of our social media accounts are linked in the episode description, so follow along through there and get involved in those communities as we continue to put things out and build that up. Now let's get into it. Let me put you in a room for a second. Executive leadership meeting, 10 people around the table, revenue is down. There's pressure from above, and one leader proposes a strategy shift. On paper, it sounds confident. Decisive, clear direction. Everyone nods. Heads move up and down. Yeah, that makes sense. I agree. Let's move forward. Meeting ends. People walk out, and within 5 minutes, the real conversation starts. Side conversations. Private doubts. Concerns that were never voiced in the room. That's not going to work. We tried something similar last year. We don't have the infrastructure for that. But none of that was said when it mattered. And now the team is moving forward on a plan that nobody actually believes in. This is what low trust looks like. Not conflict, not chaos, silence. Agreement without belief. Alignment without honesty. And that kind of environment creates a very specific problem for high performers. Because high performers don't struggle with effort. They struggle in environments where truth is suppressed, where clarity is missing, where decisions are based on incomplete information. Over time, that creates friction. Not visible friction, internal friction. The kind that slows everything down. And this is where leaders start making a critical mistake. They try to fix performance without addressing trust. They push harder, increase expectations, add more structure, more meetings, more oversight, but none of that works if the foundation is unstable, because trust is not a soft concept. It is a performance variable, and if it's broken, everything built on top of it becomes less efficient, less accurate, less effective. So the first step is fixing a low trust environment is not motivation. It's clarity. You need to understand where trust is actually breaking down, because most leaders assume it's a general issue, but it's usually not. It's specific. This is where something I call a trust breakdown audit becomes critical, not as a checklist, but as a lens, because trust doesn't fail randomly. It fails in patterns. Sometimes it's competence. People don't fully trust that others can execute at the level required, so they double check everything, micromanage, step in too often, and that slows the system down. Sometimes it's communication. Information is incomplete, delayed, or unclear, which creates confusion and forces people to operate with partial understandings. Sometimes it's consistency. Standards change, expectations shift. What was acceptable last week is questioned this week. That instability erodes confidence quickly, and sometimes it's intent. People start questioning motives. Why did they make that decision? Who does that benefit? Is this about the team or something else? When intent is unclear, trust drops fast. Now here's where this becomes dangerous. Most teams don't address these breakdowns directly. They adapt around them. They compensate. They build workarounds. More emails, more approvals, more layers. And those workarounds create the illusion of control. But they come at a cost. Speed, energy, creativity, ownership. All of it starts to decline because people are no longer operating freely. They're operating carefully. And Careful teams don't perform at elite levels. They survive for a while, but eventually the gap between what they're capable of and what they produce becomes impossible to ignore. So the question becomes, how do you start fixing it? Not in theory, not in a team building exercise, in a real environment where trust is already damaged. This is where most leaders go wrong. They try to rebuild trust with big gestures, big speeches, big resets, but trust doesn't rebuild that way. It rebuilds through consistency at a much smaller level. What actually starts shifting environments is something much more controlled: micro commitment repair. This is where leaders and teams start doing something very specific. They say what they're going to do, and then they do it. Exactly, on time, without deviation. And they repeat the pattern constantly. Because in low trust environments, people stop believing words. They start watching behavior closely. Every missed follow through reinforces doubt. Every inconsistency adds to the problem. But every kept commitment, no matter how small, starts rebuilding credibility. Slowly, quietly, but powerfully. Now imagine that same leadership team. Same room, same pressure, but this time instead of pushing forward with artificial agreement, that leader pauses and instead of asking for agreement, they ask for truth. Real input, real concerns, and then this is critical. They don't punish it. They don't shut it down. They don't defend. They actually listen. That's where trust starts shifting. Not because everything is suddenly fixed, but because the environment begins to change from controlled to honest. And once honesty enters the room, performance has a chance to improve. Because now decisions are based on reality, not perception, not assumption, not filtered communication, reality. And that's where this conversation starts to go deeper. Because low trust doesn't just affect decisions, it changes behavior, it changes relationships, it changes how leaders are perceived. And once that shift happens, the problem is no longer just operational, it becomes cultural, relational, psychological, and that's where we're going next. Because the moment trust breaks inside a team, everything changes. Even if nobody says it out loud, low trust doesn't stay hidden for long. It starts quiet, a missed message here, a delayed response, a decision that gets nodded through instead of challenged, but eventually it shows up in the room. And when it does, it changes everything. Because the moment trust drops below a certain level, people stop telling the truth. Not completely, just enough to protect themselves. And that's where performance starts breaking in ways most leaders don't immediately recognize. Let's walk into a room. Team meeting, mid-season, performance hasn't been where it should be, film sessions have been tense, execution has been inconsistent. There's frustration building, but no one is saying it directly. The head coach walks in, closes the door. You can feel the shift immediately. He doesn't ease into it. We're not playing to our standard. And some of you know exactly why. Silence. Not reflective silence. Tight silence. The kind where people are calculating what's safe to say. It keeps going. We're missing assignments. Communication is off. And honestly, some of you are not doing your job. Now the room splits. Not physically, psychologically. A few guys nod. A few stare straight ahead. A few shift in their seats. But almost nobody speaks. Because that moment has turned into a risk calculation. If I say something, how does it land? If I speak up, do I get exposed? If I'm honest, does that hurt me? And just like that, the meeting stops being about performance. It becomes about protection. Side conversations start later. In the locker room, on the walkout, quiet comments. That wasn't accurate. He doesn't even see what's actually happening. No one's going to say it though. That's low trust in real time. Not explosive, not dramatic, but corrosive. Because the truth exists, but it's no longer accessible in the room where it matters. And once that happens, leadership starts losing something critical. Not authority, influence. Because influence depends on access to reality. And in low trust environments, reality gets filtered, edited, softened, delayed. Until what leaders are working with isn't actually the full picture anymore. This is where the trust breakdown audit from earlier becomes more than just awareness. Because now you're not just asking where is trust low, you're asking where is truth being withheld. And that question is far more uncomfortable. Because most leaders don't realize how much information they're not getting. Not because people are disloyal, but because the environment trained them to be careful. And here's the part that hits hardest for high performers. Low trust doesn't just silence weak performers, it silences your best ones too. The athlete who sees the coverage adjustment but hesitates to speak up. The assistant coach who knows the scheme needs to change but holds back. The The executive who recognizes a flawed strategy but doesn't push hard enough. Not because they don't care, because they don't trust how the truth will be received. And when that happens consistently, something deeper starts to shift. People stop identifying as contributors and start identifying as survivors. They do what's required. They avoid unnecessary risk. They protect their position. And over time, the entire team starts operating below its actual capability. Not because the talent isn't there, because the trust isn't. This is where most leaders make a critical mistake. They respond to low trust with more control, more directives, more pressure, more correction. But control does not fix trust. It actually accelerates the breakdown. Because when people already feel guarded, increasing pressure without increasing safety just confirms their instinct to hold back. So if control doesn't fix it, what does? This is where the psychological safety reset becomes critical. This is not soft. It's not about making people feel comfortable. It's about making truth usable again. Because right now, in that room we just walked through, truth exists, but it's locked behind fear. That reset starts with something most leaders avoid: ownership. Not performative ownership, real ownership. The kind that shifts the dynamic immediately. Imagine that same coach pauses for a second, then says something quite different. I'm going to say something first before any of you respond. Room stays quiet, but attention shifts. If we're not playing to our standard, that's on me too. Because either I'm not seeing something clearly, or I'm not creating an environment where you feel like you can say it. Now something changes, subtly, but meaningfully. Because that statement does something powerful. It lowers the perceived risk of truth. It signals that speaking up won't automatically be punished. It opens the door, just enough. But here's where most leaders stop too early. They create the opening, they don't structure what happens next. Without structure, people hesitate. That's where intent versus impact separation comes in. Because one of the biggest reasons people hold back in low trust environments is fear of how their message will be interpreted. If I challenge this idea, do I come across as disrespectful? If I point something out, does it look like I'm blaming someone? If I speak honestly, does it get taken personally? So instead of risking misinterpretation, people stay quiet. Intent versus impact separation changes that dynamic. It creates a shared understanding in the room. We can separate what someone meant from how it landed. That allows communication to happen without immediate defensiveness. So now imagine that same coach continues. When you speak in here, we're going to separate intent from impact. If something comes out wrong, we fix it. But we're not shutting down communication because of how it sounds the first time. Now you're not just opening the door, you're making it safer to walk through. And this is where something important needs to be said directly. In low trust environments, people don't tell the truth. They tell the version of the truth they think is safest. That's the game. And once that game starts, performance becomes a secondary objective. Because now the real objective is don't get exposed, don't say the wrong thing, don't stand out in the wrong direction. That mindset kills elite performance. Because elite performance requires risk. It requires speed. It requires real-time communication without hesitation. You cannot have a high-performing team that is constantly filtering itself. It doesn't exist. So the leader's job in that moment is not to demand better performance. It's to rebuild the conditions that allow performance to happen. Because right now, the system is working exactly as designed. It's protecting people at the cost of results. And if that system doesn't change, nothing else will. Not strategy, not talent, not effort. Because the environment will continue to suppress everything that makes those things effective. So now the question becomes more direct. If you're leading a team right now and people are holding back, and communication feels filtered, and alignment feels surface level, you have to ask yourself something honestly. Did the environment teach them that? Because people don't randomly become guarded. They learn it through reactions, through consequences, through moments where speaking up didn't go well. And once that learning sets in, it doesn't reverse automatically. It requires intentional repair. Which brings us to the next layer of this conversation. Because once trust is broken at the relational level, fixing it is not about saying the right things. It's about rebuilding the system people operate inside. The way pressure is communicated. The way accountability is handled. The way expectations are made visible. Because until those systems change, people will continue to protect themselves, even if they want to perform at a higher level. And that's where we're going next. Because repairing low trust is not a mindset shift. It's a structural rebuild. And most leaders underestimate how deep that rebuild actually needs to go. By the time a team reaches the point we just walked through, where truth is filtered, communication is guarded, and performance is slipping, you are not dealing with a motivation problem. You're dealing with a system that has trained people to protect themselves instead of perform. And if you don't understand that at a structural level, you'll keep trying to fix behavior while the system keeps producing the same outcomes. Because people are not randomly holding back. They're responding exactly how the environment taught them to respond. So let's break that down. When someone speaks up in a team environment, especially under pressure, their brain runs a calculation almost instantly. Not consciously, but automatically. What is the risk of me saying this compared to the reward? If the perceived risk is higher than the reward, they stay quiet. That's it. It's not about courage. It's not about personality. It's about survival logic. And that calculation gets shaped by three things: past consequences, current leadership behavior, and clarity of expectations. If someone has spoken up before and been dismissed, ignored, or subtly penalized, the brain remembers. If leadership reacts defensively, shuts down feedback, or redirects blame, the brain adapts. If expectations are unclear and accountability feels inconsistent, the brain protects itself. So now you have a room full of capable, intelligent people who are actively editing themselves in real time. That's not a communication issue. That's a trained response. And once that response is in place, misalignment spreads quietly because now decisions are being made without full information. Problems are being partially addressed. Feedback loops are incomplete. And over time, the gap between what's actually happening and what leadership thinks is happening gets wider. That gap is where performance dies. Not dramatically, gradually, consistently. And most leaders don't see it until it's already affected outcomes. So the question becomes, how do you reverse something that people have already learned? This is where leaders need to understand something uncomfortable. You cannot ask for honesty in a system that punishes it. You have to rebuild the conditions that make honesty functional again. And that starts with how pressure is handled. Because pressure is where trust is either built or broken. This is where the pressure transparency loop becomes critical. In most low trust environments, pressure exists, but it's not clearly communicated. Expectations are implied instead of stated. Standards are assumed instead of defined. Frustration builds, but it shows up sideways, through tones, through reactions, through inconsistencies. So people start guessing. What actually matters here? What's going to get me in trouble? What's the real expectation versus what's being said? And when people are guessing, they default to safe behavior, not optimal behavior. The pressure transparency loop removes that guesswork. It requires leaders to do something most avoid. Say the pressure out loud, directly, clearly, without ambiguity, not in a threatening way, in a clarifying way. A leader might say, the standard here is execution under pressure. That means communication has to be immediate, even if it's uncomfortable. If something is off, I expect it to be said in real time, not after the fact. Now the pressure is visible. It's not hidden in reactions. It's not buried in frustration. It's clear. And clarity reduces anxiety. Because now people understand the rules of the environment. Transparency alone is not enough. Because if pressure is made clear without changing how accountability is handled, it created a different problem. People understand the expectation, but they're still afraid of the consequences. Which brings us to one of the most misunderstood dynamics in leadership: accountability. In low trust environments, accountability feels like punishment. It feels like exposure. It feels like something to avoid. So people either deflect it, or they minimize their mistakes, or they stay quiet to avoid being in that position at all. That's how performance erodes. Not from a lack of effort, from a lack of honest correction. This is where the trust through accountability model shifts everything. Because accountability, when structured correctly, becomes a trust-building mechanism instead of a threat. But it only works if it follows a very specific pattern. First, the standard is clear. Not assumed, not implied, clear. Second, the gap is addressed directly. Not emotionally, not personally, directly. This is where the breakdown happened. Third, the correction is collaborative, not imposed. What needs to change so this doesn't happen again. And fourth, the follow through is consistent, not selective, not dependent on mood or hierarchy, consistent. When accountability is structured that way, something important changes. People stop fearing it because it becomes predictable. And predictability creates safety, not comfort, safety. There's a difference. Comfort allows people to stay the same. Safety allows people to improve without fear of being attacked. And once accountability feels safe, communication opens up. Because now people know if I say something, it's going to be addressed, not used against me. And that's where performance starts climbing again. But none of this works if leaders don't reinforce it through behavior. And this is where the micro commitment repair becomes critical again. Because trust is not rebuilt through one conversation, it's rebuilt through consistency, small moments repeated over time. You say communication matters, you actually respond when people speak up. You say accountability is important, you apply it evenly. You say honesty is valued, you react well when it's uncomfortable. People are watching these moments closely, and they're adjusting their behavior based on what they see, not what you say. That's how trust gets rebuilt, or destroyed again. I've been in a room where I had to confront this directly. There was a workshop where I was part of a setting where people in the room were sharp, capable, experienced, but something was off. Conversations felt managed. People were speaking, but not fully. Ideas were being shared, but not challenged. And outcomes were not matching the level of talent in the room. At first, it would have been easy to assume it was a strategy issue, or a communication style issue. The more I paid attention, the more obvious it became. People didn't trust how their input would land, so they filtered it. I had to make a decision in that moment. Do I operate inside this system, or do I shift it? And shifting it meant taking a risk. It meant saying something that could land wrong. But more importantly, it meant saying it in a way that didn't escalate defensiveness. So instead of calling out individuals, I addressed the dynamic directly. This room is too careful for the level of talent in it. We're not getting the full picture, and it's affecting outcomes. You could feel the tension immediately, because now the thing that was unspoken was on the table. But that wasn't enough, because just naming the problem doesn't fix it. So I followed it with structure. If something is off, we're addressing it here. And if it lands wrong, we'll fix that too. We're not going to keep operating with partial information. That moment mattered, not because it solved everything instantly, but because it changed the pattern. It gave permission. And more importantly, it created expectation. From that point forward, the environment had to align with what was said, which meant consistency mattered more than intensity. Every time someone spoke up, the response had to reinforce the system. Not shut it down, not redirect it, reinforce it. And over time, something shifted. Conversations got sharper, decisions got cleaner, performance improved, not because talent changed, because the system did. And that's the part most leaders underestimate. You don't fix low trust by telling people to trust each other. You fix it by changing how the environment responds to truth, pressure, and accountability. Because once those systems are aligned, trust is no longer a concept, it's an outcome. And when trust becomes an outcome of consistent behavior, performance becomes far more stable. But this leads to the final layer of the conversation. Because once a leader understands how to rebuild trust structurally, it changes more than just the current environment. It changes how they lead permanently. And that's where this conversation reaches its highest level. Because low trust doesn't just affect performance in the short term. It defines what kind of leader you become over time. And that's where we're going next. There's a version of you that only exists inside high trust environments. Clear, decisive, direct. You say what needs to be said, you move fast, you take ownership, you challenge ideas without hesitation. You perform at a level that actually reflects your ability. And then there's another version. Quieter, more calculated, more guarded. You think twice before you speak. Filter your own words. You hold back ideas that might create friction. You start managing perception instead of driving performance. Same person, same intelligence, same capability, completely different output. That's what low trust does. It doesn't remove talent, it suppresses it. And the longer someone operates in that environment, the more that suppressed version starts to feel normal. That's where this becomes dangerous. Because low trust doesn't just change how teams performs, it changes what leaders and competitors become over time. It slowly rewires behavior. If you don't actively correct it, you don't just lead a low trust team, you become a low trust leader. Not intentionally, but structurally. Because your behavior starts adapting to the environment. You start double checking everything. You stop delegating fully. You begin over explaining decisions because you expect pushback or misinterpretation. You hesitate before addressing issues directly because you're anticipating defensiveness. And over time, that creates a feedback loop. Less trust leads to more control. More control leads to less ownership. Less ownership leads to weaker performance. Weaker performance leads to more control. And now the system is locked. This is where most leaders get stuck. because they think the solution is to demand more from people, push harder, hold higher standards, increase accountability. But if trust is broken, those actions don't land the way you think they do. They land as pressure. Pressure without trust doesn't drive performance, it drives protection, which is why everything we've talked about up to this point matters more in this phase than anywhere else. Because fixing low trust is not about adding intensity, it's about rebuilding alignment at a structural level. It starts with something most leaders avoid: clarity under pressure. This is where the pressure transparency loop becomes critical. Because in low trust environments, pressure doesn't disappear, it just becomes unspoken. People feel expectations, deadlines, standards, but no one is fully aligned on them. So they start guessing what matters most, guessing what leadership actually wants, guessing how they'll be evaluated. And when people are guessing under pressure, they default to safe behavior. That's when communication tightens, creativity drops, execution slows. So high level leaders do something different. They make pressure visible. They say exactly what matters, exactly what the standard is, exactly where the team is falling short. And they do it without ambiguity. Because clarity removes the need for interpretation. And when interpretation drops, alignment increases. Now pair that with accountability, but not the version most people think of. Because in low trust environments, accountability is often experienced as punishment, call-outs, blame, defensiveness. People brace for it. They prepare explanations instead of solutions. That's not accountability, that's threat response. So leaders who actually repair trust use a different model. They connect accountability directly to trust. If you say you're going to do something, you follow through. If you miss, you own it quickly. No hiding, no deflecting, no delay. Because every time someone follows through, trust increases. Every time someone avoids ownership, trust drops. When that standard is applied consistently, not emotionally, not selectively, something shifts. People stop fearing accountability. They start respecting it. Because now it's predictable. And predictability is one of the fastest ways to rebuild trust in any system. But none of this works if communication is still guarded. Which brings us back to something we introduced earlier: psychological safety. Now let's be clear about this. Psychological safety is not about making people comfortable. It's about making people safe to be honest. These are two very different things. Because in high performance environments, honesty is not always comfortable. Calling out a mistake isn't comfortable. Challenging a decision isn't comfortable. Admitting you missed something isn't comfortable. But if those things are not safe, they don't happen. And when they don't happen, trust continues to erode silently. So leaders who fix low trust environments reopen communication deliberately. They don't wait for it to improve, they create conditions for it. They respond to honesty without overreaction. They separate intent from impact in real time. They make it clear that someone can be wrong without being attacked. That someone can challenge without being shut down. That someone can speak without being punished. And over time, that consistency does something powerful. It lowers the cost of telling the truth. Because that's what low trust environments really do. They make honesty expensive. And when honesty is expensive, people stop paying for it. They give you safe answers, filtered feedbacks, half truths. And that's how performance dies without anyone realizing it. So when leaders consistently lower the cost of truth, communication starts opening again. And once communication opens, everything else becomes fixable. Now here's where this all comes together. Because at this level, we're not just talking about fixing a team. We're talking about defining what kind of leader you are over time. And this is the moment where most people need to be challenged directly. Because low trust environments don't maintain themselves. They're created, sustained, and reinforced by leadership behavior. Sometimes intentionally, most of the time unintentionally. But the result is the same. So the real question isn't, is my team struggling with trust? The real question is, what am I doing that is allowing this to continue? Because until that question gets answered honestly, nothing changes. You can implement systems, you can run meetings, you can adjust processes. But if leadership behavior doesn't shift, the environment won't either. And this is where the highest level leaders separate themselves. They don't just analyze the team, they analyze themselves. They run the trust breakdown audit internally. Where am I inconsistent? Where am I unclear? Where does my communication create confusion? Where does my behavior signal something different than what I say? Because trust is not built on intention, it's built on pattern recognition. People watch what you do repeatedly, and they decide whether or not it's safe to fully engage. So if you want a high trust team, and your behavior has to become stable enough that people stop questioning it. And that's where the micro commitments come back into play. Because trust is not rebuilt through one big moment. It's rebuilt through consistent follow through in small moments. Saying you'll do something and doing it, addressing something when you said you would, following up when it matters, over and over again, until the environment starts to shift, until people start speaking more openly, until hesitation starts to drop, until performance starts to accelerate again. When that happens, something becomes very clear. Low trust doesn't just limit performance, it replaces dangerous teams with safe ones. Safe teams don't win anything that matters. A team that could function but not dominate. A team that could execute but not elevate. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because careful teams don't win at the highest level. They survive, they manage, they avoid mistakes, but they don't create pressure. They don't challenge systems. They don't push limits. And over time, they get outperformed by teams that are willing to operate with full trust and full commitment. So if you're leading a team right now, or you're part of one, and you feel hesitation in the room, you feel guarded communication, you feel people holding back, that's not a small issue. That's the system breaking down. And the longer it goes unaddressed, the more it costs you, not just in results, but in identity, because you don't just lead in the environment, you become shaped by it. So the real decision in front of you is simple. Are you going to tolerate low trust, or are you going to rebuild it? Because rebuilding it requires something different: consistency, clarity, accountability, ownership, and the willingness to look at your own behavior first, not last. And that's not easy, but neither is leading at a high level. And that's what this comes down to. Because at the highest levels of performance, trust is not a bonus, it's infrastructure. It determines how fast your team moves, how clearly they think, how honestly they communicate, how effectively they execute, whether or not they can sustain performance under pressure. So if you're serious about building something at a high level, this is not optional work. This is foundational work. And the leaders who understand that don't just build better teams, they build environments where high performance becomes the standard, not the exception. Once you recognize low trust in a room, you don't get to ignore it anymore, because now you know exactly what it's costing you. If you listen to this and recognize your environment in it, then you're not dealing with a small issue. You're operating in a system that's actively suppressing performance. And the truth is, most people will leave it that way. They'll understand it, agree with it, and change nothing. High performers don't do that. They fix what's costing them results. If you're serious about fixing it, not talking about it, that's the work we do inside Premier Performance. Because awareness without action is where most high performers get stuck. They see the problem clearly. They don't change the structure causing it. That's where the real performance begins. Not with insight, with implementation. So if you're serious about building a high performance team, organization, or environment, and you know that there are gaps in trust, communication, or accountability, that's exactly the work we do here at Premier Performance. Not surface level motivation, structural change. Because high performance is not about doing more. It's about removing what's slowing everything down, and low trust is one of the biggest things that does that. So take this seriously. Look at your environment honestly. Decide what kind of leader you're going to be moving forward, because that decision is going to shape everything that comes after it. Resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here with the Premier Mindset. And as always, recognition is the first step. If we don't see things, we can't do anything about it. On top of that, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance and not replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, or persistent stress, professional guidance is critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. I make it a point to give you actionable tools to find success in your life. So let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with you all. Let me know about the successes, the disappointments, the failures, everything in between. I just love knowing how it's all going. I'd also love to hear how this episode impacts you. Share it with somebody if you thought it was helpful, but let me know how it hit you. You could leave us a review. You could also reach out with questions. We'd just love to hear from you guys. So get connected, let us know what's going on, and let us know things we can improve or things that you benefited from. If you do want to reach out, there's quite a few ways to do it. You can email me at tmailer@premierperformancereno.com. My last name spelled Mahler. You can text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. We have the Instagram and the TikTok with the same name. You can follow along there at premier_performance_Reno. We have the Facebook page and the LinkedIn page with the same names as well, which is Premier Performance LLC for both of those. We have the Twitter or the X account, which is at Premier Reno LLC, followed by our website, which is www.premierperformancereno.com. So get involved, get connected, reach out if you have any questions or issues, and let's help deal with these things together. We put content out on our social media sites literally every day, and we have new podcast episodes coming out every week. Next week, we're going to jump into mindset as a cheat code and how to use it as a cheat code in your life. So we're going to dive deeper into that, how to take advantage of that. Otherwise, enjoy your week, do your thing, go be the best you can be, and go after those goals or dreams you don't think are a little reachable. Push yourself and show yourself what you can actually do. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.